Victor, why? Deborah asked, her voice obviously tensed with tears. Why are you letting your family treat me this way? Victor stood there, arms crossed, his expression cold. He seemed distant, almost detached, as if the emotions between them had long since evaporated. Deborah had tried everything to make him see how much she was hurting, but today, nothing felt real anymore. It was as if they were living in different worlds. When did I become God? Deborah's voice was low. To give myself a child? Deborah felt her heart shatter. The desperation in her chest clawed at her throat, but she swallowed it down, trying to keep her composure. It had been years since they'd been trying for a child, and the pressure from Victor's family only made it worse. The constant whispers, the judgmental looks, and the well-meaning but invasive questions, she could never escape it. But what hurt the most was Victor's indifference. "That's your business, woman," he said, dismissively waving his hand in the air as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. "And for your information, I'm actually tired of it all, and I want a divorce." Deborah's mind went numb for a moment. Divorce? Had they really come to this? She couldn't understand how things had spiraled so far. The man she had once loved, the one she thought would stand by her through everything, was now turning his back on her. The idea that he was tired of her, of their marriage, felt like a brutal slap. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice trembling, fighting to keep the tears at bay. Victor didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a brief moment, Deborah searched his face for any sign of hesitation, anything that would tell her this was some cruel joke. But there was nothing. His eyes were cold, his jaw set. "Yes," he said finally, his voice final, devoid of emotion. "I can't do this anymore. I need a way out." Deborah felt as though the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. The thought of a divorce, after everything they had been through, seemed unreal. She opened her mouth to speak, but found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned away, trying to steady herself. The weight of his words crushed her, and it felt as though she was suffocating in the silence between them. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They had built a life together, dreams they had shared, promises they had made. But in that moment, she realized those promises had been broken, shattered by a man who no longer cared, who had given up on them both. Victor turned to leave, but Deborah stopped him. "We haven't tried everything. Please, Victor. And there's nothing wrong with me," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. Victor didn't even look back. "I don't care anymore, and I am not trying anything else with you. You are not a woman, and I regret ever spending my hard-earned money to marry my fellow man." With that, he walked out, leaving Deborah standing in the middle of the room, her heart in pieces. The weight of his words echoed in her mind. Deborah slumped into the sofa, allowing her tears to fall freely. She felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, the overwhelming emptiness that came with Victor's words. She lifted her head, staring at the ceiling, her eyes bloodshot, searching for something she could no longer find answers, or even peace. Where had it all gone so wrong? She whispered to the stillness of the room, her voice quivering with the weight of her disbelief. She had loved him with everything she had, trusted him, and had believed, despite everything, that they could overcome the struggles they faced together. But now, all that was left was a feeling of abandonment, a sense of betrayal so deep it seemed impossible to escape. She wasn't ready for a life without Victor in it. The thought of it felt like an insurmountable mountain, too high to climb. But more than that, Victor and his family had successfully reduced her to nothing, to a woman who wasn't enough. The endless comparisons, the scorn, and the accusations that she couldn't give him what he wanted, the child that had become a symbol of her failure. Her heart ached as memories flooded her mind. Was it the constant uninvited visits from Victor's family? The way they would show up at her doorstep without warning, their arrival a silent demand for her hospitality. They would barge in like they owned the place, filling her space with their voices, their judgment. She would barely have time to prepare for their presence. And still, they'd criticize her for not keeping the house. Just so, for not having everything in place at the drop of a hat. Was it how they would enter her kitchen without asking, rooting through her pots, criticizing her cooking, as if she were incapable of managing even the most basic of household duties. They would take what they wanted, leaving her to clean up their mess as though she were invisible in her own home. No matter how much she tried to please them, it was never enough. It never even seemed to matter. But it wasn't just the uninvited visits or the intrusions into her home that stung. It was the cruel words they used on her. Barren, they'd call her, as if her value as a woman was tied to her ability to bear children, as if she wasn't a person anymore, but a failure. And worse still, there were the whispers, the mockery how they'd call her a man disguising as a woman. Their hurtful words aimed to wound her self-worth, to make her feel like she was less than human. It went on and on. The cutting remarks, the judgmental stares, the endless comparisons to other women who had been able to give Victor what she could not. And in the end, it wasn't just the physical strain of trying to conceive, the constant doctor's appointments, or the test sit, was the emotional toll. The feeling that she was always being watched, scrutinized, that she could never measure up to the expectations of a family that never once gave her the benefit of the doubt. Deborah's hands shook as she wiped her tears, but she didn't have the energy to move. She felt empty, like a hollow shell, stuck in a life that she no longer recognized. She had loved him so much, but now, she wasn't even sure if she loved herself anymore. Victor's family had slowly chipped away at her confidence, at her ability to stand tall. And now, in the silence of her home, it all felt like an irreversible collapse. How had she let this happen? How had she lost herself so completely in the shadow of their cruelty? Victor had been her everything, but it seemed that she had never been enough for him or for anyone in his family. Yet, Deborah got up, unwilling to believe that Victor actually meant the divorce. She couldn't fathom it, surely. This was just another of their heated arguments, another fight that would blow over in time. She went about doing house chores mechanically, trying to push the thought of his words out of her mind, telling herself that this, too, would pass. The mundane tasks were familiar, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become too unpredictable. But deep down, her heart raced, unsure whether to hope or to prepare for the inevitable. In the evening, as the sun began to set, she heard the sound of the front door creaking open. Her heart leaped in her chest. She rushed to the door, her mind clouded with a mix of anticipation and fear. Maybe Victor had come back to apologize. Maybe there was a chance to fix things. She opened the door, a smile already forming on her lips, but the sight that greeted her shattered every hope in an instant. There stood Victor, his hand firmly entwined with that of a woman Deborah didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. The smile that had been on Deborah's face froze, replaced by a sickening twist of confusion and disbelief. "Out of my way, woman!" Victor screamed, his tone sharp and harsh as he shoved her aside, pushing past her into their home with the strange woman still at his side. Deborah stumbled back, her legs weak, her heart pounding in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway. The reality of what she had just seen hit her like a tidal wave, her breath caught in her throat. Did Victor just bring another woman into this house? Her mind screamed in disbelief. And into our room? Anger surged through her as the adrenaline kicked in. Her hands balled into fists, and she rushed to the door, banging on it desperately. "Victor! Victor!" she screamed, her voice raw with emotion, as she pounded the door with all the strength she had left. The door unlocked from the inside with a violent click, and Victor's voice erupted in a fury she had never heard from him before. "Are you out of your mind?" he cursed, his anger boiling over as he stepped out into the hallway. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes burning with contempt. "What is wrong with you?" Deborah's chest tightened as the words she had feared were spoken aloud. "Did you just bring another woman in?" Before she could finish, he interrupted, his voice bitter and cold. "Yes," Victor shouted, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "I did, so she can do what you couldn't for the last 7 years." Deborah's heart broke with those words. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't allow herself to break down, not yet. "And I am warning you," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "I do not want to be disturbed. If you make me come out here again, you won't like me at all." He gave her a final, contemptuous glance, before slamming the door shut, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. Deborah stood there, motionless, her whole body trembling. She didn't know when the tears began to fall, but soon they came, hot and silent, streaking down her face. Her breath came in shaky bursts as she slid down the wall, her back slowly sinking to the floor. She sat there, a broken shell of the woman who had once loved him, as the sobs quietly racked her body. Each tear felt like an incision into her soul, each one cutting deeper than the last. She buried her face in her hands, trying to muffle the sound of her pain. But then, as the sounds of her sobs mixed with the muffled voices from their matrimonial room, she did the only thing she could think of. She covered her ears, hoping that the physical barrier would block out the reality of what was happening inside. The sound of their laughter, their whispered conversations, their shared moments was all too much. It was all happening in the space that had once been theirs, in the room where they had promised to love each other forever. But forever was no longer a promise. It was a lie. The next morning, Deborah woke to the sharp sound of the doorbell ringing, followed by the weight of her own exhaustion. She hadn't slept a wink, her eyes red and swollen from crying the entire night. The house, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt like a foreign, empty shell. When she opened the door, she was met with Victor's face cold, his posture stiff-fanned in his hand, a thick stack of papers. He didn't even look at her when he handed them over. "Here," he said curtly, his voice void of any empathy. "You need to sign these. The divorce is final." Deborah's heart dropped into her stomach. She looked at the papers, but it felt like her mind was moving in slow motion, unable to process the cold finality of it all. Victor didn't say anything else before turning and walking away, his new partner, Deborah's replacement, waiting for him by the car, a smug expression on her face. The door slammed behind him with an unforgiving thud, and Deborah stood there, staring at the divorce papers in her hands. It felt unreal, as though she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She had no choice but to sign them. There was no pleading left, no more room for negotiation. Her marriage, once her whole world, was gone. Her hand trembled as she signed the papers, her signature flowing across the document, as if she were a mere spectator to her own life. Every stroke of the pen felt like a surrender. She had no fight left in her, no strength to argue or bargain. Victor had made his choice. Once the papers were signed, Deborah looked around the house empty, silent, just like her heart. She felt so small, so insignificant in this house that was once filled with dreams and promises. Without another word, she packed her bags. She didn't know where else to go, but she knew she couldn't stay here, in the place that held all the memories of a broken life. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing that woman take her place. She couldn't bear the thought of her old life continuing without her in it. Her only option, the only place that felt safe, was her brother's place in Lagos. He was her last tie to family, the only surviving family member she had left. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had no other siblings. Though it had been some time since she'd seen him, she knew he would take her in without question, without judgment. He was the one person who might still remember Deborah before all the pain, before all the destruction. She left Abuja without a second glance, heading toward the only place that could offer her the solace of familiar faces. Lagos was a city of noise and life, but for Deborah, it felt like a new beginning. She hadn't been ready to start over, but life had decided it for her. She tried to push the memory of Victor out of her mind, but his face, his words, the image of him with that woman, everything clung to her, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. This was Deborah 3 years ago. As she looked at her twins running around the sitting room, her heart swelled with happiness. Moving to Lagos and signing those papers was the best thing she did for herself. At first, it was difficult. She was consumed by grief, feeling as though she'd lost everything. But leaving Abuja gave her the space to breathe, to heal, and most importantly, to meet Daniel. He was young, caring, and everything she had never imagined she deserved. He had been patient with her, offering support when she thought her heart was too broken to love again. She had thought it was impossible to trust anyone again, especially after all the pain she had endured with Victor. But Daniel showed her that love didn't have to be cruel, that it could be kind, tender, and real. He didn't rush her. He allowed her to take her time to rebuild herself, to rediscover who she was outside of her past. 2 months into their marriage, Deborah discovered she was pregnant. Her greatest fear, the fear of never becoming a mother, melted away when she saw the 2 pink lines on the test. Daniel was overjoyed, and for the first time in years, Deborah felt whole again. She no longer felt like she was lacking. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: love, stability, and a family of her own. Now, 3 years later, as she watched her 2 beautiful children chase each other around the living room, Deborah knew she had made the right choice. She had come so far from that broken woman who was once left questioning her worth. Her twins, with their laughter and energy, filled the void that had once seemed endless. She smiled at Daniel, who was sitting nearby, his eyes full of pride as he watched their children. In the past, she couldn't imagine ever finding happiness again, but now, she was living proof that new beginnings were possible. She was no longer defined by her past, but by the strength she had found in herself and the love she had chosen to embrace. Victor's call was unexpected. Deborah had long moved on from her past with him, focusing on building a new life for herself. She was stronger, healed, independent, and no longer defined by the scars he had left behind. Sitting at her desk, organizing her thoughts for the day, she felt a pang of disbelief as her phone buzzed. It was her brother, Chuka. "Deborah, it's Victor. He called me earlier and said he has something important to discuss with you. He's coming to Lagos next week and wanted me to let you know." Deborah's heart did not skip a beat. No flutter of old emotions, no trace of fear. She'd put Victor behind her years ago, and she wasn't the same woman anymore. The years of emotional abuse, the manipulation, and the pain had all been healed with time, therapy, and strength she had built within herself. She no longer felt tethered to him or to the past. "Thanks for telling me, Chuka," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm good. There's nothing I need from Victor anymore." Her brother hesitated for a moment. "You sure, Deb?" He sounded, I don't know, a little different this time. Maybe... Deborah interrupted gently but firmly. "I've moved on, Chuka, and I don't think I need to revisit anything with him. Not now. Not ever. Deborah, I know you've moved on, but you've been through so much. Don't you think you deserve to at least know what he wants? Maybe there's closure in this for you. For all of us." Deborah hesitated. Her mind flashed back to all the painful memories of Victor. And yet, she wasn't the same woman who had once feared him. She was stronger, more resilient. But Chuka's words lingered in her mind. What if this was the final chapter? What if I could end it all, once and for all? "Fine," Deborah said softly, her voice firming as she made her decision. "I'll meet him, but only to hear him out. And once I do, I'm done. No more." Chuka sighed with relief. "Good, Deb. I know it's not easy, but I'm proud of you for this." She hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of apprehension and indifference. She had healed, but there was always that lingering curiosity about why Victor wanted to see her now, after all these years. Later that evening, Deborah sat down with her husband, Daniel, and their twin children. They were finishing dinner when she told Daniel about Victor's call. "I'm going to meet him, Daniel, just to hear him out. He wants to talk," Deborah said quietly. Daniel paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing in concern. "You're sure about this?" Deborah nodded. "I'm sure, but you know I'm not doing this alone. I need you with me. I want to show him who I've become. I don't need his validation, but I'm not letting him think he can walk all over me again." Daniel smiled, a protective look in his eyes. "You've come so far, Deb. I'll be there, and so will the kids. We're a family, and no one's going to put us down." The day came, and Deborah arrived at the popular Lagos beach with Daniel and their twins in tow. She could sense the quiet hum of excitement as she walked along the golden sands, her mind still uncertain about what Victor had planned. But one thing was certain. She wasn't the broken woman who had left him years ago. Victor was already seated at a table with his pregnant mistress, an air of superiority around him. He seemed almost smug, as if he were anticipating Deborah's reaction, thinking she'd crumble when she saw him. But when Deborah approached with her family, His expression shifted from arrogance to shock. He had expected her to show up alone, vulnerable, perhaps even seeking his approval or begging for answers. What he didn't expect was the sight of Deborah, walking confidently beside her husband and children, radiating strength and success. Deborah held her head high as she introduced Daniel and the twins, her voice steady and proud. "Victor, this is my husband, Daniel, and our twins. Daniel, these are my old acquaintances, Victor and his guest." The look on Victor's face was priceless. His jaw tightened as he glanced at Deborah's flourishing family, unable to hide the surprise and embarrassment creeping into his expression. The woman he had once discarded, believing her to be nothing, was now living a life he could never have imagined for her. Deborah had risen far beyond his expectations. Victor's eyes flicked toward his pregnant mistress, but there was no pride in his gaze now, only shame. He had come to humiliate Deborah, but it was he who had been humbled. Deborah had moved on, and her success shone brightly against his failures. As they all sat down, the air was tense. Deborah, Daniel, and the twins were relaxed, laughing and talking among themselves, as if Victor and his mistress were nothing more than strangers. Meanwhile, Victor, his mistress, and the rest of the table were consumed with an awkward silence. Then, the surprise came. After their meal, Daniel effortlessly picked up the tab. "We'll take care of everything," he said with a smile, handing the waiter more than enough to cover their meal. "It's no problem at all." Victor's pride was crushed. His plan to show off his new life a complete failure. Deborah had achieved far more than he could ever imagine. Her family was thriving. Her life had bloomed into something beautiful, and all Victor had left was a hollow victory with a woman who was only a shadow of the one Deborah had once been. As Deborah, Daniel, and their twins walked away from the table, leaving Victor and his mistress in stunned silence, Deborah felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her. She had done it. She had faced him, not out of need or desperation, but out of strength and clarity. She was no longer the woman he had tried to control, and he could no longer break her. Deborah had moved on, and there was nothing Victor could say or do to take that from her. She was whole, and she was free. 9 months came and went, and Victor's mistress gave birth to a baby girl. At first, he felt a fleeting sense of pride. Perhaps this was his fresh start, a new beginning to prove that he had moved on and built something better. But deep down, doubt gnawed at him. Something felt off. Unable to shake the uncertainty, Victor secretly arranged for a DNA test. When the results came back, his world crumbled. The child was not his. His hands trembled as he stared at the papers, reading the words over and over again, hoping he had misunderstood. But the truth was undeniable. Rage and humiliation boiled within him as he stormed into the apartment he shared with his mistress, his voice shaking with fury. "You lied to me," he spat, waving the test results in her face. "This child is not mine. Who is the father?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a cold, mocking laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she leaned back against the couch. "Oh, Victor," she sighed, her tone dripping with amusement. "Did you really think you could get anyone pregnant?" Victor's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" She stood up, arms crossed, looking at him with an expression that made his blood run cold. "You're not man enough, Victor. You never were. You think Deborah was the problem all those years. The issue was you all along." Her words hit like a hammer to his chest. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "That's not possible." She smirked. "Go to the hospital. Get yourself checked. Maybe then you'll stop blaming women for your failures." With that, she grabbed her bags, picked up the baby, and walked out of the door without another word. Victor stood frozen, his pride shattered into a million pieces. For years, he had pointed fingers, blaming Deborah for their inability to have children, using it as an excuse to mistreat and discard her. He had convinced himself she was the barren one, the reason he never had the family he wanted. But now, standing alone in the empty apartment, the weight of reality came crashing down on him. Desperation clawed at his chest as he made his way to the hospital, praying, begging for a different outcome. But when the doctor called him in and delivered the final blow, it was over. "Mr. Victor," the doctor said, glancing over his medical file, "your test results show that you have a condition that has made it impossible for you to father children. This is not something new, it has likely been the case for many years." Victor's heart pounded in his ears. "So, you're saying, all this time?" The doctor gave him a sympathetic look. "Yes, it was never your ex-wife's fault. If anything, she must have suffered a great deal believing it was her." Victor sank into the chair, his mind racing. It was too late. Too late to trace his steps back. Too late to undo the years of pain he had inflicted on Deborah. Too late to tell her the truth, to apologize for blaming her for what had never been her fault. She had moved on, built a family, and was living a life he could never be a part of. And now, when he finally saw the truth, he had nothing. For the first time in his life, Victor felt the weight of true regret. Sometimes life has a way of playing its card back,